The most exciting chess player of the moment is, of course, Hans Niemann. He has 5.5 out of 6 at the Tournament of Peace in Croatia, playing fantastic chess. Not only the score is brilliant, the way is probably even more impressive. How he manages to score his points with a lot of sacrifices, taking risks, not afraid to take up the challenge against the very strong grandmasters. And in round 7, he is playing against top grandmaster Ivan Sokolov, who nowadays is actually more known as one of the best chess trainers in the world. It's a very exciting game, and also you can sense the rivalry between the two players, because Sokolov also was very clear in his statements on Twitter some months ago, where he was taking stance against Hans, his cheating experiences in the past. And well, when you give your statements, you know that the opponent can be even more motivated. So let's see what happens in the game. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, of course, if you would like to see more exciting games. I appreciate all your support. I'm totally neutral. I'm not going to give my opinion, but I think Hans is playing fantastic chess so far. Let's have a look. He played the move e4, and Sokolov, his main repertoire is based on the move 1 e5, knight f3, knight c6, and we have the Italian opening. So bishop c4, bishop c5, c3, knight f6, d3, d6, castling kingside. Black played here the move h6 just to make sure that knight g5, taking the pawn on f7 is never going to be any problem, or otherwise even the bishop could come to g5, pinning that knight on f6. So h6 is a useful move. It's going to be a slow game. Both sides are getting their pieces involved. So knight bd2 is played. Black played here the move a5. This is sort of modern treatment of the Italian game. The pawn on a5 covers the b4 square, so white cannot really easily advance that b pawn coming to the 4th rank. So the game continues with rook e1, castling kingside, knight f1, and well, this is a very important juncture, which has been seen in many top grandmaster games, and especially Hikaru Nakamura has played this position dozens of times with the black pieces. There are various interesting options for black, including advancing the pawn to a4, maybe even a3 can be played. That's one idea. Bishop e6 is a good developing move, but the move played by Sokolov is also very typical for the Italian structures, as the knight on c6 is not doing that much, so it's being rerouted via e7 to g6. And when the knight can get there, well, the knight is better placed on the king side. It overprotects the pawn, and later on there are ideas for black maybe to play c6 and d5, and then you see how useful that knight is on g6. But there's a clear drawback to this move, as the knight at this point doesn't have that much control over the center, and therefore white played here the move d4, attacking the bishop, putting more pressure against the pawn on e5. So black is kind of forced to take the pawn. E takes d4, c takes d4, and now white has a nice pawn center. 2 versus 1, more space, and okay, the bishop is under threat, so the bishop goes back. And well, the question is, what should white do to make use of that space advantage? Well, things are not that simple. For instance, if you play a move like knight g3, bishop g4 can be very unpleasant, as the knight on f3 is pinned, the bishop hits the pawn on d4. So instead of putting the knight on g3, the typical move also is h3, which was Hans' choice in the game, and I think it's a good move. It's designed against that move bishop to g4, but enables black to strike back in the center with the move d5, attacking the bishop, attacking the pawn. If you do take on d5, the knight recaptures with a nice blockade. You're controlling white's IQP, isolated queen's pawn. So that's not the main move. Hans played here the move e5. He's ignoring the bishop, and you don't have to be afraid of this move, d takes c4, because you take on f6 and you're attacking the knight. If you do take the pawn, it's bishop takes h6, and black's king is just wide open. That's simply too risky. So therefore, the thematical response is to place the knight in the center. The knight is being supported by the pawn on d5. Now the bishop got to move. The bishop goes to d3, and well, white is about maybe to take this pawn on e4, but black is striking back with the move c5. So even if that would cost the pawn, white has to give up its bishop on d3. I don't think black has to fear that at all. And what white probably should do here, the most solid way of playing, which was not played in the game by Hans, is just taking the pawn on c5. Now after bishop takes c5, you gotta watch out for this pawn on f2, but after bishop e3, white has a very nice grip in the center. Its minor pieces are pretty well placed, controlling the center. Black has an isolated pawn now. I like white's prospects here, but Hans decided to play the move knight g3. And I'm not sure that is exactly what you're supposed to do here as white, because to me, just taking on g3 looks so natural. After f takes g3, this diagonal is open, this bishop on d3 is strong, and I'm not interested in winning the pawn. What I want to do here as black is play bishop f5 and get rid of white's most powerful piece, and I don't think there's any reason to complain for black. However, Sokolov played here the move bishop f5 right away, and frankly speaking, even though it's an interesting move, it felt a little strange to me to give up your bishop that easily for a knight. Well, white also has possibilities to take on e4, but they're followed knight takes f5, bishop takes e4, d takes e4, rook takes e4, and white is a pawn up. But this was a very conscious decision by black, as now the queen comes into d5. The queen is actively placed, hitting the rook, and the rook goes to g4. The rook stays on the 4th rank to keep the pawn on d4 protected, but at the same time, of course, white is contemplating some attacking ideas against the black king. So what is logical here? Well, I was thinking taking the pawn on d4 makes a lot of sense. Just regaining the pawn, and if the knight will come under threat, let's say of queen d3, queen e6 can be played, and everything is very well protected for black. So no problems here whatsoever, but the move king h8 was played. Why is this move played? Well, I think Sokolov, after the move queen d3, he wanted to take with the knight on d4. This was played in the game, and now it's clear that had the king still been on g8, there is bishop takes h6. This is no longer possible because the g-pawn is no longer pinned, but there are other problems in this position. And at first it may look as if black is in good shape, the rooks are connected, and white also needs 1 or 2 more moves to get all its pieces into the game. But there's a key move here, knight to g5. So it's another game in which Hans Niemann is sacrificing a piece, and it's a serious move because you're threatening checkmate in 1 on h7. That's very clear. And of course, the big question is what happens if you take the knight? Well, there were other possibilities as well. g6, for instance, is an interesting move, but I'm not sure why black didn't want to play this move. Maybe there's something like rook h4 pinning this pawn on h6. There are a lot of ideas, but after a move like queen takes e5, you're taking that valuable pawn. After rook takes h6, king to g7, it looks as if white has some dangerous threats against the king, but the knight and the queen are fantastically placed in the center, and I don't think there's any reason to be afraid here. Anyway, this didn't happen. After knight g5, Sokolov took the knight on g5. Bishop takes g5, and the threat here is to go rook h4 check, and after the king goes back to g8, it's queen h7 with checkmate. How to stop the mating threat? Well, you cannot play g6. It runs into bishop f6, and if the king goes to g8, it's rook h4, for instance, and mate cannot be avoided on the next move. That's a beautiful mating pattern with bishop and rook. So the only move here is to play here knight f3 with check. So that opens up the path to the queen. So black is of course threatening to take the queen. White first eliminates the knight by taking with the queen on f3. Queens will be exchanged, and black has managed to avoid an immediate disaster against his king. But he is a pawn down, and well, I don't think the position is very pleasant because the bishop on g5, it's controlling the open file. So if white gets time, he will bring the rook to the open file, and things are looking very dangerous. What should be played here? Well, things are not that simple, but the bishop is looking awful on b6, and well, maybe a move like bishop c7 is worth considering, attacking that pawn. If you protect it, maybe a move like f6, and after pawn takes, you're still a pawn down, but trading off pawns and probably more pieces later on, it's not a bad thing to do. Also, the pawn on f4, the double pawns, they are vulnerable in an endgame. So that would have been a way to keep the game going for black. But Sokolov went for the move bishop d8. He wants to exchange bishops. If bishops are coming off the board, black actually activates its rook first. And that's something you better avoid. So Hans keeps the bishop on the board, hits the pawn on c5. Bishop goes to e7. And here it's time to mobilize the pawn. So you can play f4, maybe f5 can be played. I think playing that move right away makes a lot of sense. But Hans wanted to play king h1 first. So what is the idea? He wants to make some space for its rook to come over. But after rook f e8, he played the move f4 anyway. So not sure the king is that well placed in the corner. There's no reason to be afraid. In end games or in positions with queens coming off the board, you would rather have your king somewhere in the center to support your pawn majority. But okay, this didn't happen. And well, question is, what should black do here? I'm thinking that a move like b5, looking for counterplay with these pawns is worth considering. But then the pawn will come to f5. These pawns are very strong. The rook can support the pawn next. White is having a very clear initiative. Instead, Sokolov went for the move bishop f8 to overprotect the pawn on g7. Now it's harder for white to play the move f5 because the pawn on e5 will be hanging. But there is the move a4, and that's a very fine positional move because with the move a4, you're basically neutralizing black's extra pawn on that side of the board. Rook a6 was played, so the idea is to get the rook into b6 and attack the pawn on b2. But here another nice technical move. Hans goes for the move bishop d2 with the idea that after c4, which was played, white places its bishop on c3 to protect the pawn on b2 and get ready to play the move f5. So the bishop has a double function of consolidating the queen side as well as supporting the pawns on the king side to come forward. Rook h6 played, attacking the pawn on h3. White protects it with king h2, bishop to b4. You don't want to lose the pawn on a5. If you don't play bishop b4, this pawn is hanging, therefore this move is played. Now, you would expect white to take over control over the open file. That's a logical move, but here Hans shows fantastic technique by playing the move rook a to g1 first, hitting the pawn on g7. Now black played here the move g6. And now the rook comes back to the d file. I think this was a very clever decision because by provoking black to play g6, the rook is not able to come back into play via the 6th rank. Bishop takes bishop, pawn takes back. And well, this rook on h6 is definitely out of play. White as a pawn up is controlling the open file and ready to start targeting the weak pawns on the queen side. Rook e7 was played to guard the pawns on the 7th rank. But the rook comes to d5, threatening the pawn on a5. Black played the move b6. Now rook to d4, attacking the pawn on c4. Rook to c7 played, only move to protect the pawn. And after rook d6, this pawn is hanging as well. And here Sokolov had seen enough. Maybe a lot of people of you would think this is a premature resignation, but the position, the longer you look at it, the more depressive it becomes. Because if you defend the pawn on b6 by playing rook b7, a move like f5 can be played. That's a very nice idea as you're threatening to take the pawn on g6. That's one idea. Black cannot take on f5 because the rook on h6 is hanging in that case. Also rook takes c4 is an idea. And apart from these ideas of winning a pawn, white may even consider playing the move f6 to start playing against the king. Imagine white gets the possibility of bringing two rooks to the back rank. There are all sorts of mating ideas as the pawn on f6 deprives the king from coming to the center, to g7. So Hans wins another game. 6.5 out of 7. And that means he has now a 3000 ELO performance rating. That's absolutely insane. To be precise, it's 3003. But anyway, having such a score against this kind of opposition is very impressive. And Hans, after the game, he came to the Twitter sphere and he said there that he was very glad to destroy one man's ego, if I'm quoting him correctly. But that's very personal, as he's trying to bounce back from the tweet of Sokolov taking stance against him for its cheating affair. So, of course, this is to be continued. Probably Sokolov will speak out at some point as well. We're all curious to hear from Hans in the next couple of games. Let me know what you think of this game. Make sure to subscribe, and I will see you back very soon again. Bye bye.